Welcome to the Prolific Pulse Poetry Podcast and YouTube. This is your host, Lisa Tomei. I'm happy to welcome Jesse Stanchak. Today, he's the king of Twitter with all of his wonderful tweets. Welcome.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. I don't know if I'm the king of Twitter. I don't think I'd want to be, but I do have a fun time there.
Yes. So tell us a bit about yourself. Where are you from?
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but I've lived in the Washington, D.C. area most of my life now, as an adult anyway. And I was a journalist by trade. This is, sort of relevant to how I get into writing this stuff. I was a documents-based reporter for something called Congressional Quarterly, which meant that I would read enormous federal documents and then have to figure out in a couple of sentences how to explain what this actually said, so that you knew if you needed to read the whole thing or not.
Right.
And that was my whole job, was writing summaries of huge reports. And
Right.
then I went from that to writing for a website called Slate that used to have this feature where they would condense the front pages of all the major newspapers, and I would write that overnight. And then I went to go work for a company called SmartBrief, where I wrote summaries of news articles. Like, this just kind of became my thing for a long time. And I learned to write as short as humanly possible. I'm a big fan of Ezra Pound's definition of poetry. I mean, we can debate all day what poetry actually is, but I always like this one, that poetry is condensed language. It is packing as much meaning as possible into as small a space as you can manage. And that was just what I did all day, every day for, the better part of a decade. And along the way, I had this moment, I guess in 2017, I was asked to give a speech for a former English teacher of mine who was retiring after like 30 years, and he was one of the people. I was one of the people that he wanted to speak at his retirement dinner, and I gave this great speech about like optimism and how I admired the fact that like he had grown so much as a person. Even as in the time that I'd known him, he'd learned new languages and picked up new instruments and become a published playwright and done all this stuff when most people stop growing at a certain point, and how everyone, if they were sad that he was retiring, should go out and do the same thing. And then I had like this existential crisis on the drive home where I went, oh my goodness, I'm a fraud. I'm not doing that at all. What can I do? What can I fit into my life that will be new and different and challenge me? And I've always had an interest in creative writing. I minored in it in college. I majored in telling the truth and minored in lying, which I think says a lot about me. And I said, well, okay, I can't commit to writing a novel. Like, that's setting myself up for, I had like a 2-year-old kid at that point. Like, it was just more than I could take on. But I knew that there were a number of Twitter accounts that did sort of short fiction. And I said to myself, just the way my brain is wired, if I tell people, like Babe Ruth, if I point at the fence and say, here's what I'm going to do, that I'm going to write 3 of these things every day, I'll do it, because it's public and because people would theoretically notice if I stopped. And little by little, for the last 3.5 years, that audience has grown and gotten, more passionate. And I haven't missed a day since July 11th of 2017.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
You have an interesting Twitter page, and it's
Yeah.
all yours. It's all your
It's all
work.
me. People do occasionally write to me and say, hey, can I submit something? And I always have to say, sorry, it's not a journal. It's just me. Occasionally people think that I'm more than one person because the approaches that I take are so different.
Yeah.
If you're doing 3 of these a day, all right, and at this point it's like a little over 4,000 stories. You can't just do the same move over and over again. People would get sick of it. And so because I had this forced march of creativity going, I sort of put on different hats and adopt, different styles. And some of them, really, lean into poetry. Some of them are very plot driven. Some of them are just dialogue, and there are a lot of different tones. There's a lot of stuff. I feel bad. The things that always go viral are stuff that's funny, which yeah, sure, fine.
Yeah.
But they're not all funny, and like very intentionally so. So sometimes, I pre-write these and I'll have something funny, blow up, and then the next one will be like really scary, and people are like, "What is this? What have you done to me? I didn't sign up for that. I'm sorry. I don't." There's no easy way on Twitter to like communicate to people that like this is going to be maybe a little more complicated than that first tweet led you to believe.
Where do you get your ideas from?
A couple of places. One is something. There's a Dr. Seuss book that actually was in the news recently because it has some outdated racist depictions called "To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street," but I read it as a kid, and it sort of stuck. It rattles around in your brain, and I think the core metaphor is still apt. It's about a boy whose father demands that he explain what happened to him today every day when he gets home from school, and he's terrified that the story he tells will not be good enough. So he sees a man pulling a man with a horse and a cart on Mulberry Street, and he goes, "Okay, that's something, but that's not very interesting. What if it was a camel pulling a cart?" And it gets bigger and bigger and crazier and crazier. And a lot of my stories start with really mundane things that I'll notice, like a neighbor coming out and every day checking to make sure that their car is locked. And like I'll see across the parking lot a light flashing, and I know that that's what's happening. And why are they doing that? What is that about? Or it could be, something genuinely unusual, like finding a dollar bill taped to a signpost. And who is that for? Why did they do that? What would happen if I took that dollar? You just sort of, you tug at that thread, and if you tell yourself, okay, you have, 20 minutes to take this ordinary occurrence and lie and exaggerate and make it into a tall tale, you can get pretty far. Another method is I meditate every day, and as you're doing that, when you're trying to focus on your breath or whatever it is that you're doing, the mind wanders. It's what minds are meant to do, and mine goes to some pretty weird places, and maybe I'll be breathing, and suddenly I'll think about somebody getting stuck on an island. All right, why are they on the island? How did they get to be there? Are they happy about it? Why might they be happy about being stuck on an island? And you can just kind of ask questions and interrogate that situation until you get something that's kind of fun. And then two other cheats, real quick, that if you're ever stuck for an idea, are always good for at least a shot. Taking something figurative literally, like if someone says, "I want to take the time to do something." What if you actually had to take the time from somewhere? Where would it come from? What would that mean if you had to physically take time maybe from someone else? And the other is the anthropomorphic fallacy. If you think about what an animal or an object or a plant wants and what they think about all day while you're wrapped up in your human nonsense, you can get some pretty fun stuff out of that.
Oh, sure. That sounds
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Would you like to read us one of your
Yeah,
tweets? Or
absolutely. Yeah, sure. I can pull up a couple. So, like I said, there are a whole bunch of styles and genres that I go into, and I tried for this to pick a couple that are more poetry-ish. They're all written in, I guess, technically in prose, but Billy Collins says that the difference between poetry and prose, and I like this, is that poetry is a break in the silence, and prose is a continuation of the noise. And I like to think that these things, because they stand alone, they don't connect to anything else. I never revisit a premise or anything, that they exist in this sort of bubble of white space.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, they're poems. All right, here's one. None of them have titles, I'm afraid. That's not really
It's okay.
space effective, but in love, into place, down a rabbit hole, through the cracks, behind the curve, out of favor, from grace. Before this is over, you will have time to ponder all the ways a person can fall.
I love that because it leads you one way, and then
Uh-huh.
that very last line, I guess you could say,
Hmm.
takes it a different direction. I like that.
Yeah. And that's a slightly less flippant version of that, what if something figurative was literal principle? Because
Hmm.
it occurred to me one day that we have so many like idioms that require somebody falling, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. And in that one, I've tried to sort of place them on a continuum. It
Hmm.
starts with falling in love, which I think most people would say is unassailably good. And by degrees, it gets worse for, whoever this is, until they're falling from grace. So,
Now, you said that you never revisit. Do you ever try to write any poetry a lot after you do like some of these tweets? Do you ever
mhm.
develop them into any more poetry or anything like
Yeah.
that?
So sometimes, and I love the way you phrased that. The way a lot of people say this to me is, "Do you ever try to make anything real out of them?" And that
Oh,
irks me
I didn't mean
because,
that.
oh no, I know you didn't.
Yeah.
I wanna make this point that to me these are complete.
Mhm.
Like they don't. Um, there are instances where I have gotten to the end of this and said, there actually is more here, but that is absolutely the rarity. I think most of these things are perfect in their way,
Mhm.
exactly as they are. And one of the things that I love about this format is because it's public, okay,
Mhm.
I get to exist in dialogue with
Mhm.
my readership in a way that authors always have, but had the luxury, I guess, of ignoring. Um, and there are people who, in almost every tweet, there will be people who will suggest other places that this can go, some of which I would never have thought of. And or we'll say we'll ask questions about it, like who are these people, or what is this place, or what did you mean by that, that maybe hadn't occurred to me during the process. And what I religiously always tell people is that
Mhm.
all versions are canon. Um, if you read science fiction or fantasy, things that come in long, series, canon becomes something of a sore subject for people, both because it can be used for gatekeeping, who's really a fan. If you don't know who Revan is, are you even a Star Wars fan? Of course you are. But it can be used that way, but it can also be a source of contention, like what stories are canon and which ones aren't canon. What really happened to Luke
Mhm.
Skywalker? Which stories are real? And to me, that is singularly unproductive, right? If you have what's called headcanon, if you have a version of the story that exists in your mind, that is exactly as real as anything that George Lucas or Disney ever wrote. All right. Like none of this actually happened. So your imagination is as good as anyone else.
Mhm.
And I try to lean into that as much as I can. If people, say, oh gosh, is this protagonist dead and a ghost and they don't realize it? Yeah. If that is what it means to you, that's exactly what happened. And I like that this short format is long enough for me to introduce ambiguity and not long enough for me to resolve it. So in a lot of ways, I don't want to come back and resolve the chord by writing more stuff. I just love the space that it creates.
Right. And that also kind of answers some of what poetry is too, and that is for
Hmm.
the reader to end up asking the question from the
Yeah,
poem,
exactly,
where do they go
exactly.
from there? It's going to be different experience for each person that reads that.
Yeah. It was really hard for me when I first started doing this as somebody who has always written for a living, but always written nonfiction for a
Hmm.
living. Uh, to have to deal with people coming out of the woodwork and saying, no, your happy story should have a sad end, or your sad story should have a happy end. Like, they both initially felt like, no, how can you take this thing that I've written and take it off in a direction that I didn't intend? But of course, everyone does that all the time anyway.
Hmm.
And I just know it now. And I think I developed all versions are canon both as armor, to sort of
Hmm.
protect my ego, but also as a way of protecting people from me. If I say that every time, then I don't have the power to come in and say, no, you're wrong,
Hmm.
you know? And
Right.
that safeguards that space.
Right. It's like, really, who is to say what's right or what's wrong
Yeah,
anymore?
exactly,
I'm
exactly.
subject to
That's the fun of it.
interpretation.
That's the fun of it.
Now, you
Would you like
bring
another one?
into a poem your own experience. Yeah. Yes, I would love to hear another one.
Sure, yeah. Um, as a joke, he paid to have a toenail clipping shot into space, to tumble in the void forever. An aeon later, a passing probe picked it up, analyzed it, and sent the data home. They thought his DNA was a song, the loveliest they'd ever heard. They sang it until their sun went out.
Mm.
Uh, a lot of my uh, I've been working on like collecting these into a book, like the really good ones at least. And if you sit down and come up with 3 ideas a day for 4 years, you will, and then try to analyze that, you'll notice patterns emerge, right? There
Mhm.
are things that your mind gravitates to over and over again that you may not be aware of. And for me, it was surprising to learn, because I don't really read a lot of fiction or poetry that gets into this, but I'm obsessed with time and the passage of time, and the manipulation, or the idea of manipulating the passage of time. And more than probably one particular thing, there are more stories about time on my channel than anything else. And so this one takes place on like a cosmic scale, right? Literally aeons. There are people who've done this, who've had pieces of their indelible body, either uh, skin or hair or toenail clippings or ashes, ejected into space. Um, and as you know, like, there's no momentum, or no inertia in space. Nothing will ever slow that canister down. It'll tumble forever. But the universe is huge, and you haven't mapped that out forever. It'll run into something or go by something eventually. And I started to think about, okay, like, what would happen if you found, if a sentient race found remains of a person, in absentia, like, they've never seen a human being, they don't know how this would relate to us. They just know that some other race of sentient being took it upon themselves to preserve this fragment and send it out, so it must have been important.
Mhm.
And how would they make sense of that? And I like the idea that a mundane, frankly, slightly disgusting part of a human body could bring joy and happiness and meaning to a planet full of beings that we cannot comprehend on the other side of the universe, and we would never know it. Like, that
Mhm.
would be effectively the most important thing this person had ever done, and they would
Right.
never know.
Yep. That's interesting. That's an interesting analogy of that.
Yeah.
So, so you're thinking about doing this in a book?
Yeah. Provisionally, I'm titling it "The Tyranny of Sand," which is a line from one of these stories. And but for me, it has sort of a double meaning because sometimes, not often, but occasionally, when I'm writing these, it can feel like I'm just weighed down by the weight of infinitesimally small particles, right? It's, the idea of being buried in sand is incredibly terrifying to me.
Yeah.
And, so it's a metaphor for the stories as well. And the challenge actually isn't saying, okay, do I have good material? Because I've been doing this, like I said, for as long as I have. I want this to have 280, which is like 7% of the total output. So it really is just sort of the best of the best stuff. The problem is actually sequencing, because the tone can be so radically different. There are, stories about vampire missionaries on the one hand, and then some really sad ones about, say, bad things happening to children. Okay, how do those two stories exist in a collection? And how do you bridge the gap between them so that people don't get whiplash going
Right.
from one to the next?
Hmm.
Because I think it's one thing to experience that on Twitter, right? In a medium that's free and that is interspersed with billions of other ideas.
Yeah.
But if you're going from page to page, like, what is the logical sequence? And that is what's taking as long as
Right.
it has. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I did a story on Twitter. Each day I wrote a segment, which
Hmm.
each segment could be freestanding, but
Hmm.
then it continued into, I did it to response in response to prompts.
Hmm.
And finally, I just got to the point where I didn't know where to go with it anymore, so I just stopped doing it. But
Hmm.
I thought about putting that into, I saved it all, and I thought about putting it into a book form. But
Hmm.
yeah, organizing it, getting it in just the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky. And like, some people said, well, why don't you do a book of just the funny ones, and or just the scary ones, or whatever? And the truth is, I don't think that would represent the work well.
Hmm.
Not because, well, for two reasons. One, because that's not what the project is. The project is everything.
Hmm.
And two, because I think that, all right, have you ever read any Terry Pratchett?
Mm-mm. I don't
Okay.
think so.
He's a comedic fantasy author, all right? And he writes like these Jonathan Swift-esque um, like satires of modern life that are set in a fantasy world.
Hmm.
My favorite is about how the mail would work in a universe that had magic. And they're brilliant and very funny. But if you read too much of him in a row, like if you just like get on a kick and read a bunch of his work,
Hmm.
like the magic wears off. He has like a bag of tricks, and you can kind of start to see the wires if you read too much of it. And I worry that if I just did the scary ones, you would begin to see how I did it if you just sort of encountered them all at once. I think you need sort of the oscillation for them
Hmm.
to be as effective as they are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the same like if you put a book of, if I put a book of poetry together, like I do that a lot. I do that as a publisher and I do that for myself.
Hmm.
Um, Finding that right way to align things so that, you know, you're
Hmm.
right. You don't want to just go with on the dark side all the time or go on the light side. You got to figure out where your happy medium is. And it's a challenge. It is.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Would you like to take us out with one more
Yeah,
piece?
sure. Here, why don't we do, actually, I can do the one that has that line in it, the ostensible title story. I'm just gonna take a drink. The man rides the horse across the high desert. The horse thinks of water and hay and apples. The man thinks of whiskey and the letter in his pouch and the tyranny of sand. The desert thinks only of conquest, spreading a little faster than the horse can run each day.
Wow. I felt that one.
Yeah,
I felt that
yeah,
one.
yeah,
Goodness, that's
yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah, I'm proud of that one.
Yes, you
Uh,
should be.
yeah, yeah.
Jesse, is there anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to
Oh
share?
gosh. No, I think we've sort of covered a lot of stuff. I feel like honestly, I talked more than I really meant to.
No,
Uh,
that's okay. People are here to listen to you, not to me.
yeah,
Well,
that's
thanks
fair.
a
That's
lot.
fair. Sure, of course. Thank you for
Thank you
having
so
me.
much. You have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.